When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the Hooded Man in A Dance with Dragons. And this character's been very mysterious. We see Theon seeing this character in literally like a paragraph or two in A Dance with Dragons. And this person maybe is allegedly killing some of the people in Winterfell and helping create a lot of the issues going on at Roose Bolton's camp in Winterfell. Because as we see with A Dance with Dragons, the main conflict in the north seems to be between Stannis and the Boltons. Now, the Boltons have a couple of northern houses that are backing them, but we have a lot of reasons to believe that those northern houses are not really working in the Boltons' best interests, and even more so with the Freys because of the Red Wedding. So when we see this character of the Hooded Man pop up with Theon when he's at Winterfell, there's been a lot of speculation brought up about the character because it's a very odd confrontation. It isn't something that lasts very long, but the description of the Hooded Man and the conversation that happens are very odd, and we've never gotten confirmation onto the Hooded Man. So let's talk a little bit about the known deaths that are happening in Winterfell, who those might be from, and the relation that that has to the Hooded Man, because in the Hooded Man section, Theon believes that this could have been the person that is doing all these different murders. So the known deaths that we have in A Dance with Dragons in Winterfell are Roger Ryswell's groom, Aenys Frey's squire, a Flint Man, Yellow Dick, a companion of Ramsay, and Little Walder Frey. So all of these are interesting because none of them really happened to the quote-unquote like Stark loyalists, for instance. So when we look at the Stark loyalists, we think of House Manderly, House Umber, maybe even House Dustin, but this happens to the Frey camp, to the Ryswell camp, to the Flint Man, which that one we're not even sure was actually even a murder. It very easily could have just been an accident, given it's like a horse kicks the Flint Man. It doesn't really seem like that one was a murder, but it could be. Yellow Dick, who is definitely a Bolton guy, especially closer to Ramsay, and then Little Walder Frey, well, is another Frey, but I also think that that doesn't really have relation to the Hooded Man. So likely it's known that probably the Spearwives were involved with killing most of these people, especially Roger Ryswell's groom, Aenys is Frey's squire, and Yellow Dick, just given the fact that when Theon kind of comes to this conclusion himself, that they have been the ones killing some of these people in Winterfell, they don't even really shy away from it. And if you also think about the manner in which some of these men were killed, a lot of the times it's with these men either not having clothes on, or in Yellow Dick's, his manhood was stuffed into his mouth, and it was done so crudely that like his teeth are broken because of it. And so these men died in a way that seems like these women, the Spearwives, got them into a compromising position, maybe offering sex, and then killed them. That makes sense for, I think, at least 3 of these. Like I said, I think the Flint Man was probably just an accident that was kind of also lumped into these mysterious deaths and murders. And then Little Walder Frey seems way more likely that it was Big Walder, just based upon the fact that Big Walder is always talking about trying to get further up in the Frey line. And even think about some of the earliest moments we have with Big Walder and Little Walder. It's on the news that Stevron Frey dies, and both of them don't even care. It's also to justify Jojen's dreams and what he tells Bran and his like prophecies, more or less. And so you also look at the character of Big Walder. You know, he has these bloody hands in relation to Little Walder's death, seems to indicate guilt. So when you think about all of these known deaths, none of them, in my opinion, seem to indicate that it was a Hooded Man. Now, the Hooded Man could be helping the Spearwives, could be involved in a northern conspiracy, whether that's with a character like Wyman Mannerly, who's, you know, plotting to get Rickon back and putting him and establishing him as the Lord of Winterfell. Or it could be with a character like Mor's Crowfoot Umber, who arrives at Winterfell, and there's a lot of interesting maybe connections we have with him and this Spearwife group. And you also just have a lot of different factions working for maybe trying to get Stannis to win. And you think about what the outcome is. The Freys get sent out into going against Stannis in a land they don't know that well, with the Manderlys as well, and that seems to be what Stannis is wanting. Stannis is not worried at all about being attacked. It almost seems like he's baiting them in to attack him specifically, and so it seems like these deaths are very calculated. They're to put that distrust and to grow the tensions within the castle. And we know that plan works basically flawlessly. As you have the phrase the Manderly's throats, and it's such a desperate situation that Roose is kind of fearful. Even Theon picks up on that Roose seems to have some sort of doubt, and at this he sends out basically the Frey and Manderly armies. So in terms of the actual deaths, I don't think any of them really are just the hooded man specifically killed these people. But let's look at the actual interaction and try to figure out some of the clues for who the hooded man could be. So the hooded man finds Theon in the chapter The Ghost of Winterfell in reference to, well, Theon. But you also think about the way that this hooded man arrives. He kind of seems like this very ghostly figure in terms of he's hooded and he has a dagger, and the way he approaches Theon when it's basically in the middle of like a blizzard and there's snow coming down and it's super high. The hooded man strides towards Theon almost with this confidence. And as the two meet, the hooded man almost instantly recognizes Theon, calling him a kinslayer, and that he is false, and wondering how Theon is even alive. And so the kinslayer thing doesn't make a lot of sense right away, because on one hand, Theon is a Greyjoy. He was never Brandon and Rickon's brother or anything like that, so him being a kinslayer doesn't make sense if you believe he killed Brandon and Rickon, if you don't. The only way that could make sense is if you are someone that was at Winterfell and maybe saw Theon grow up with Bran and Rickon. And so Theon would have been considered like their brother. So for instance, when Catelyn hears the news of what happens to Bran and Rickon, she thinks about how Theon had eaten at her table and all this stuff since he was a young boy. And so you could make that idea. So it already paints the idea that the person that is the hooded man has to have a personal knowledge of Theon to some degree. And that's really something that's important. But something else I want to raise with this is the idea that when Theon is instantly recognized, it's very odd, because if you're somebody that didn't know Theon was still alive and what had been done to him, how would you instantly recognize Theon? Because Theon is visibly aged. I mean, his hair has basically gone like he's an old man, like it's white at this point. He doesn't look anything like Theon used to. Remember, the way we come into the character of Theon in A Dance with Dragons, it's completely unfamiliar. Even the people coming to get Theon don't even recognize him. He's completely changed overall. And so if you're somebody that was, say, a guard, or you were somebody at Winterfell before Theon did all this stuff, and now you come back to him, and remember, it's also not the best conditions. Like, Theon couldn't see that far in front of him because of the snow and the blizzards and all that. How would you instantly recognize that this was Theon if you already thought that he was dead? Because the hooded man asked Theon, how are you still alive? And so Theon says, the gods are not done with me. He shows him his maimed hand, all that kind of stuff. But that's a huge detractor I have in this theory, is that when you look at any character now about who could this possibly be, you have to remember they instantly pick up on who Theon is before Theon even really speaks, but they also didn't realize that Theon was alive at the same time. That to me is very suspicious. So let's then look at the idea of who calls Theon a kinslayer, because this is usually where the theory goes. Theon is only called a kinslayer by really two other people. One of Mance's spearwives, being Rowan, and also Crowfood Umber. Now this is very relevant given the fact that Crowfood Umber has a lot of coincidences that happen in A Dance with Dragons. Because when we see the hooded man, it is pretty much the exact same time that Moore's Crowfood Umber arrives outside of Winterfell's walls. That is very interesting, because that either would imply that as Crowfood Umber arrives, that also seems to indicate when the hooded man comes. Because if you're the hooded man and you've been in Winterfell for a long time, how would you not know that Theon is alive? Like, it's not like Theon is necessarily hidden and he's walking Winterfell like every night. Like, how would you not know that to be the case? You'd be a terrible spy if you didn't know that. And so that is a really big part of this, is that we have to look at the character of Rowan and also Crowfood Umber, because could Crowfood Umber be involved in this whole plot that Mance has going on in terms of trying to get Arya to be freed, or the fake Arya, I should say, and trying to sow chaos within Roose Bolton's ranks? Because that all could be very important. They both have connections to Stannis, with Mors being part of Stannis' army, and also Rowan being sent by Melisandre with possibly an alternative motive that Jon doesn't know. Jon was sending them to try and save Arya, or who he believes is Arya, but there also is something else there. Melisandre has her tricks. And so you might be asking, why do I keep making some sort of connection between Rowan and Mors Umber? It's just the idea that Mors had a daughter and she was taken by the wildlings. And when you look at the character of Rowan, she has this weird respect for the Starks. Why would a wildling spearwife have a lot of respect for the Starks when she's a wildling? They're completely opposite ends of the spectrum. They hate each other for the most part, at least the wildlings should. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then also her deep hatred for Theon, it's just really weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless Rowan had some sort of background of being, a Northman. And it would make sense if she was brought up by the Umbers and then she gets taken, that she would already have that background. And then that would have a connection there with her then to Crowfoot Umber. But then it also even makes more sense because when Theon and Jane, or fake Arya, actually escape, conveniently Mors is the one that's able to capture them almost immediately. If that had not happened, they might have been taken prisoner once again by Ramsay, and who knows what would have been done. But I do want to dissuade the idea that this hooded man actually was Crowfoot Umber, because, well, Mors doesn't have an eye, and Theon looks directly at this hooded person, and they have both of their eyes. So unless this is a glamour by Melisandre or something along those lines, which we're not really given any indication that that's the case, this doesn't seem to be the person from who it is. Now, could it be somebody that is working on Mors Umber's orders? Totally could be, trying to help the Spearwives, all that kind of stuff. There's definitely, I think, enough evidence to possibly suggest that that could be the case. But then let's look at a couple people that could possibly be the hooded man. And again, I want to point to the idea that this person seems to, if it's not, which we'll talk about, Theon's imagination or his split personality or something, it has to be somebody that seems to be familiar with Winterfell and would be familiar with Theon himself to call him a kinslayer, just based upon the idea that he views Theon, Bran, and Rickon as being like siblings. So the first proposed person that people have said it could be is Robert Glover. This is the same Robert Glover that appears in Davos's last chapter in A Dance with Dragons, who is working with Wyman Manderly of trying to bring the Stark restoration. Now, the biggest issue right away here is that Robert Glover wouldn't be calling Theon a kinslayer, because Robert Glover, based on the last chapter, knows that Rickon and Bran at least escaped or are alive. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for Robert Glover to then call Theon a kinslayer and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't really check out. And so Robert Glover has the motivation to try and be doing all this sabotage and maybe working with the Stark loyalists, but it doesn't fit the actual character. And Robert Glover as well wouldn't be super familiar with Winterfell either, you would assume, and also wouldn't be super familiar with Theon to where he would instantly recognize him either. So I don't really think that this is the case, but I know people have brought it up, so I did want to point to it as well. Moving on, we have the idea that it could be Harwin. Now, this is the same Harwin we see in A Storm of Swords with Arya, and Harwin was one of Ned Stark's soldiers that he brings south, and he ends up in the party sent with Beric to go deal with the Mountain. That ends up going horribly awry, and Harwin finds himself with the Brotherhood without banners. So the idea for Harwin is, we know Lady Stoneheart is searching for Arya, and Harwin has a closer relationship with Arya, given that you have that heartfelt meeting between the two in A Storm of Swords, and now you have the motivation with Lady Stoneheart being at the head of the Brotherhood without banners to go and look for Arya. And given the news is that Arya is being sent to the north and that she is being married to Ramsay. The big issue I have with this one is there's no indication that Harwin has left the Brotherhood. We don't see any reference to that in Brienne's chapter in A Feast for Crow, her last one. And we also have to assume that, again, remember, the Brotherhood know the last whereabouts of Arya. That Arya was probably with the Hound, all that kind of stuff. And if you really just dissect what's being said in these rumors, you would realize Arya is not at Winterfell. Just based on the fact that, okay, there's this Arya that was sent from King's Landing that was then sent to the Boltons, and then the Boltons took her north. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because they knew where Arya was during around the events of A Storm of Swords. It wouldn't make sense if then she was then sent from King's Landing. Like, that's what you'd have to say. The idea would have to be that Lady Stoneheart is willing to follow up on any lead, and so she just sends Harwin just in case, even though all the information would dictate that was not the case. So I could see the idea of Harwin. It would make a lot of sense. He would, be at Winterfell. He would have been there as, Theon, Rickon, Bran. They were growing up together. Maybe would have considered them kin. And so you can get to the indication that A, he would hate Theon for what he did. And two, you can understand why maybe he would call Theon a kinslayer. So some of the things fit here, but it also leaves a lot of doors open. Like, how does Harwin get there? Because Moat Cailin is shut off. Did he maybe go through Howland Reed and go through that way, going through the neck? Because we know he didn't just, like, say, for instance, just get himself with the Bolton party that heads back up north. We know that's not the case, because if that was the case, he would have realized Theon was alive much earlier on and would have had news of Theon. It had to have been a thing where, like, he travels almost by himself, attaches himself to some party, and then enters Winterfell and finds all this stuff out. I think it's possible. I just don't know if there's enough to suggest that this person is Harwin. The next person that I've seen in the major theories is Hallis Mollen. This is who In Deep Geek believes is the person, and I think there's some interesting evidence, even though I don't come to the same conclusion. So Hallis Mollen is the man that is sent to really guard Catelyn. He is with her when she goes to, for instance, Storm's End and goes to see Renly and Stannis. She's the person that Catelyn sends with Ned's bones to go into the crypts at Winterfell. And so Hallis Mollen is a important figure, right? He has Ned Stark's bones, but we know that Moat Cailin gets closed to them, and so it wouldn't have been passable for Hallis Mollen. Catelyn even thinks about this later on, like, where did Ned Stark's bones end up? We also know from the character of Barbary Dustin, it appears that they have not made it north either. So it would indicate that Ned's bones probably ended up with Howland Reed, or maybe they just never got there. They were killed along the way, and now Ned's bones are just, scattered to the winds, which I don't know if George would necessarily do, but those are the kind of like the ideas that I would have. And then with the idea from Hallis Mollen is knowing that, what happens at Winterfell, the idea that the Greyjoys, then the Boltons take it, and this idea of fake Arya being married to Ramsay, and you also having the combination of a bunch of other people being there as well, with Mage Mormont, Galbert Glover, the news of possibly Jon being Rhaegar and Lyanna's, and also Robb's will. It could maybe lead to the idea that you send Hallis Mollen to go to Winterfell to maybe just sow some chaos in Winterfell and to possibly figure out what's going on with this Arya stuff. And then once Hallis Mollen gets there, he realizes all this isn't the case, that this Arya character isn't actually Arya. At that point, he just kind of starts acting on his own and doing his own stuff. But like we talked about, the Hooded Man likely hasn't actually killed anyone of note that we know of yet. So what has he really been doing? Why is there significance to this character that's been put there? It would also make sense from the point of view of Hallis Mollen would know of Theon. He would have known of the relationship between Theon, Rickon, and Bran, and maybe said, okay, well, you're a kinslayer. He would have hated Theon for everything that he did. That all kind of makes sense. But the other issue is, once again, would Hallis Mollen recognize Theon almost instantly? And it just kind of circles back to this idea for me, is that no matter what you look at for who possibly could be the Hooded Man, is the Hooded Man has to contradict themselves regardless of the way the theory goes. Because on one hand, they have to recognize Theon enough to where they're familiar with him, but they also at the same time not think that he was alive. And so at the same time, the way that Theon is so disfigured and looks so terrible, they somehow have to instantly know that that is Theon, when it's like, that just doesn't seem to be natural. And also, you think about it from the other way around. Theon has no recognition of who this Hooded Man is. So, how does Theon not recognize this person that he would probably know if they were at Winterfell, but the other person recognizes Theon, when Theon's appearance would be way more altered than the other person's? So there's a lot here to me that just doesn't feel right. There's something fishy here. And so that leads to the last theory, is the theory I've always believed, and I think it has holes in it. I think every theory about the Hooded Man so far has holes. I don't think any of them fit perfectly. But the theory I believe in the most is that this is really just Theon seeing maybe a younger version of himself, albeit the appearance of the hooded man is not actually younger Theon, but it's like his personality. It's a version of himself. That's one of the biggest issues with the Theon theory, is that Theon doesn't recognize or seem to recognize his younger self. It isn't something that he thinks about later on. But when you think about the title of the chapter, and Theon himself constantly is thinking of his past deeds, the actions he's done, that there are ghosts here at Winterfell and they're angry with him. Think about A Clash of Kings after he actually kills the Miller's boys. We see Theon as he's completely paranoid. It seems like in all of his dreams he's haunted by nightmares. The castle of Winterfell itself seems to be wanting to throw out Theon. He doesn't go anywhere without guards anymore. His confidence is kind of worn down because of his actions. Theon feels like he's trapped, like it's Harrenhal at the end of A Clash of Kings. And so when you come back there for Theon, you kind of already have this building up of Theon seeing ghosts at Winterfell. He, for instance, sees Bran in the Weirwood. He's hearing his name. Maybe the old gods are communicating to him. The ghosts of Winterfell are talking to him. And when you have that part of it being there, that there already is this mysterious, ghostly feel to both the chapter and Theon's storyline at Winterfell. Plus, you build up the idea that Theon and his whole main arc of A Dance with Dragons is about identity. It's about the Reek Theon persona, and it's not necessarily about him going back to being Theon Greyjoy, because when he goes back to being Theon, it's not the Theon Greyjoy of his younger years. It's a much more matured and hopefully better version of Theon than he was when he was younger. And so this could be a possible confrontation with the younger version of himself, now mixed with Reek, and also mixed with the new Theon that he wants to be. And you even think about the wordage of certain things. So people that have a big argument with the Theon theory is, why would Theon, if this is a younger version of himself, or this is some split personality thing, why would Theon call himself a kinslayer? Theon, at the very beginning of A Dance with Dragons, even says he's not a kinslayer. And so this comes down to a tough point here, because you can interpret this many ways to try and fit the theory. One of them is Theon subconsciously realizes that the Miller's boys could actually be his own children, just based on the fact that he slept with the Miller's wife a few different times. There's not a lot of evidence to indicate that is the case, but it could fit the idea that maybe Theon subconsciously knows that to be the case, and that's why he calls himself a kinslayer. You could also look at the idea that his actions caused others to die. So, for instance, him taking Winterfell and him pretending that he kills Bran and Rickon directly leads to the death of Robb, someone he considered to be a brother, the one person of the Starks that he grew close to. Theon's actions directly got Robb killed because it leads to a whole trickle effect. Theon betrays Robb, didn't inform Robb what was going to happen in the north. He betrays him. He takes Winterfell. It makes Robb look weak. It makes it to where it's like he's the king who doesn't even have the north anymore. Also, his heirs are killed, so it makes him more vulnerable at that point. It leads Catelyn to release Jaime. It's a whole trickle effect. And so it could be this whole bigger thing that Theon is not saying that he's a kinslayer because of, Bran and Rickon, because he obviously knows he didn't kill Bran and Rickon, but his actions led to, well, Bran and Rickon haven't been seen since that point. Maybe they died. His actions could have led to Bran and Rickon possibly being dead in his own head, even if he wasn't the one that actually did it. So there's a lot of stuff here that you can use to fit the theory of why Theon, in a younger version of himself, would be telling his present self that he's a kinslayer, because it's maybe some of its insecurities. And you even think of the way it's so accusatory towards Theon. It doesn't feel like a normal conversation. Like, you don't go up to somebody and go, oh, Theon, and then titles, and then just accuse him of stuff and then walk away. Now, some people have also looked at the idea that Theon doesn't seem afraid by the hooded man, even though he believes this hooded man could be the person committing all these murders. He's not scared or anything. I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with this being just a ghost and Theon knowing this person won't kill him because they're not real. I think it has more to do with the fact that Theon is such a broken version of himself that he would rather die than, for instance, ever have to be tortured by Ramsay again. He's at a point where he doesn't want to live anymore. So, of course, he's not going to be afraid of somebody, killing him. And so I look at this ghostly version of Theon, and I think it fits perfectly with what happens at the end of this chapter. By the end of the chapter, Theon, doesn't want to die as Reek anymore. He's kind of transforming into Theon again. Now, we're not going to see that full transformation really until like his last chapter, but it starts that journey. It gets that whole conversation going that this could be Theon confronting, his younger self. And I think the biggest issues with this theory are obviously, one, Theon doesn't recognize himself as the hooded man. He gets a good look at him. There's no indication that he recognizes this person, regardless of who it is. The second problem is obviously the Kinslayer part, and that kind of has an issue with almost all of the theories. But it would make sense given the way that this hooded man seems very confident. And you even think about the way that A Clash of Kings introduces Theon, where he has like this hooded cloak and he has a dagger on him and stuff. Like, it kind of would be nice, parallels when we first get with Theon with his first chapter in A Clash of Kings. But it doesn't necessarily fit one for one. And so the biggest issue with the hooded man is that it doesn't fit any real theory perfectly. There's a possibility that every person I talked about in today's video could be the hooded man. There's a possibility that none of them could be. This hooded man maybe is possibly just nobody. It's just really, it's this hooded man showcasing the way the North feels about Theon. It could just be some random person, I think there's some issues with that, because why do they instantly recognize Theon? But that's a whole different thing. So let me know what you guys think about the hooded man theory. I know there's other people that some people just bring up, and even if you look on the wiki for the theories, there's other people that are listed, like Septon Shale, but there's just not anything there, and it's very unlikely. So I wanted to bring up the ones that at least made the most amount of sense to me, but I do personally believe it is Theon. I think this is one of the most clever theories in the community, and I think it's really awesome if that is the case. I could also see this as George himself doesn't know the answer to who the hooded man is. Sometimes George leaves the door open to certain things, and then maybe he fulfills them later on, and maybe we'll find something out. This was whoever. But thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.